Hi, friend. Welcome. We only have 3 verses today. It's pretty straightforward. Paul continues making his case that Abraham, it was his faith that was counted to him as righteousness, not circumcision. And he continues to unfold that case in today's passage. So let's just go ahead and start by reading the passage. All right, this is Romans 4, verse 9. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Okay, pretty straightforward, huh? But let's just tease it out a little bit. All right, what I noticed is Paul asks and he answers a series of questions, right? Here is that fictitious dialogue that he is having. And I love it that he's making it abundantly clear by going ahead and answering his own questions. All right, I think we can understand this. So his first question is in verse 9, is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? And I asked, what blessing, right? So we have to go back to yesterday and see in verse 6 that Paul referred to the blessing that David spoke of. Here, I'll read verse 6 for us. Just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. So the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. This is a picture of Abraham. This is a picture of David. We teased that out yesterday. And a blessing is a declaration that a person has a favored status, all right? Has the favor, has the grace, has the forgiveness of God. God has covered him with his righteousness, his own goodness. Okay, that's the blessing. And then, so Paul asks that question, and then he answers it right there in verse 9. We don't have to go very far. For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. It had nothing to do with his circumstances, with his circumcision. Once again, in this passage, we have a lot of focus on circumcision, and we need to understand, once again, this was the act of removing the male foreskin. It was a rite of passage for the people of Israel that went all the way back to Abraham. And the cross references here are Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 and 11. And we really have to put on our first century ancient Near East glasses to understand, look, this was a big deal. I know it's kind of foreign and weird to us, but this was a big deal to the Jews that Paul was writing to. Remember, Paul has already alluded that they put their reliance on circumcision and the law, that they have both of these things, so we're good with God, right? But Paul is making the case, no, let's look at Abraham. It wasn't about circumcision. He had faith before he was circumcised. That's what Paul goes on to say. So we see this in verse 10. Paul asks 2 more questions. He asks the how question and the when. How then was this righteousness counted to Abraham? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? Paul again makes it abundantly clear. He says, look, it was not after, it was before he was circumcised. Remember, our cross reference yesterday was Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. That's the citation. And he, this is Abraham, believed the Lord, and then the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. It couldn't be any clearer. All right, so Paul makes it abundantly clear that Abraham's faith was counted to him before he was circumcised. Verse 11, hold on. He goes on. Yeah, I ask the question. Verse 11, I ask why. Why this rite of circumcision? Why did Abraham receive the sign of circumcision? And Paul answers that. He says he received it as a seal of the righteousness that he had while he was still uncircumcised. All right. A seal is an indication. It's a confirmation. It's proof. It's an authentication of Abraham's righteousness that he had before he was circumcised, this righteousness that he had by faith. So circumcision was really just a mere confirmation of his faith. It was a covenant that was made between him and God after he believed. All right, we might ask another why question. All right, kind of like a 3-year-old, right, or a 4-year-old or 5-year-old. Why? So why? Paul goes on to say, look, notice in verse 11, he says the purpose was to make Abraham the father of all who believe without being circumcised. All right, so I made a little diagram, and at the top I put Abraham is the father of all who believe. Abraham is the father of all who have faith in God. He is the father for those who are uncircumcised. Let's look at exactly how Paul says it. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that the righteousness would be counted to them as well. Meaning, look, this promise that was made to Abraham wasn't just for those who were circumcised. It was a promise for all the people of the world. And that's why Abraham oh gosh, I'm going to get tongue twisted here. I need to slow down just a minute. This is why Abraham, his faith was credited to him as righteousness before circumcision. This paves the way for all who are uncircumcised to also be credited with the righteousness that comes by faith in God. All right, so Abraham's the father of all those who believe who are uncircumcised, and he's the father of all those who believe who are not merely circumcised, but Paul says also walk in the footsteps of the same faith as Abraham had before he was circumcised. All right, what does it all boil down to, friends? Faith. I go back to verse 9. We could go back to, what verse was it yesterday? Verse 3. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It comes down to belief, having faith, having trust in God. It's always good every time we open up the Bible and look at a passage to ask that golden question, what is it that we learn about who God is? What does Paul know? And what is Paul indicating today about God? What do I learn about him? Friends, if we stop and just Paul, I'm so sorry. If we stop and we pause, we see that, look, this blessing, this is God's blessing. God blesses. God pours forth his righteousness. In my mind, I'm looking at his righteousness as his abundant goodness on those who have faith, on those who believe in him, put their trust in him. Friends, what do we learn about God with that? He is gracious. He is merciful. He is steadfast in his love and faithfulness. And we see that God desires our trust. Like implicit in all of this is that God desires our faith, our trust, our belief in him. And as we mentioned yesterday, this is the way that we have friendship with him. God desires our friendship. And I also realized today that God makes the way very clear and simple within this passage. He doesn't make it too difficult for us to understand. No, he says through Paul, believe, have faith. And friends, that's my application, a simple application for today. Walk by faith in Jesus.